President Biden is facing backlash after announcing a new immigration policy. His order authorizes U.S. immigration officials at the southern border to deport large numbers of migrants without processing their asylum claims, and is leading to some confusion.
So many people trying to enter America can now be deported, and while proponents of this new policy say it may lessen congestion at the southern border, critics say it's only going to encourage people afraid of being deported to flee to sanctuary cities like New York.
A freight train carrying hundreds of migrants now speeding toward the U.S. border. Those on the front lines warn it's a literal embodiment of the challenges we face as a country.
Hundreds of people rallied today in the city against President Biden's executive order restricting the amount of asylum seekers who come into the country.
While demonstrators say it's an attack on migrants, others say the president's executive order is necessary.
He said he was going to support the immigrant community.
The immigrant community is under attack by both parties.
A little too late. I mean, after millions have gotten through, we have a lot of work to do to deal with the people that we have here who are committing crimes.
And while the president's new executive order can shut the border down, it does make some exceptions. For example, it does not apply to legal immigrants or to unaccompanied minors.
It's not secure. They're coming. We still have our pursuits. The cartel has not shut its operation down, and they've had no intent. They have the will to go ahead and exploit our border.
On Wednesday alone, 2,000 migrants were apprehended. The new reality appearing to change the minds of Americans on the best way to respond.
So a controversial new ban on border crossings is now in effect, causing many to question the future of the asylum crisis. But although critics on the left and on the right have problems with this new policy, what nobody's talking about is that although it might actually decrease migration at the southern border, it may encourage it to America's largest sanctuary city. Because even though the border might be tougher to cross, once you get to New York, your immigration status no longer matters. Because this city denies no one access to its incredibly generous safety net, which provides temporary room and board for single adults, along with unlimited room and board for families with children. Plus, there's access to education, healthcare, and prepaid debit cards to help with nutrition. And one of the most controversial sanctuary policies in New York is that if the police arrest somebody who's wanted by federal immigration, they don't hold on to that person and they don't tell ICE that they have them in custody. And although proponents say this policy is designed to shield immigrants from unfair or unwarranted law enforcement actions, like deportation, when you combine this with New York's willingness to provide every one of life's necessities along with caseworkers to expedite applications for asylum and work permits, critics say New York will continue to remain a top destination for immigrants regardless of whether or not the border is open, closed, or both. And that brings us to the real reason New York City's asylum crisis is far from over, because just as the federal government clamps down on the southern border, activists here in New York are rallying against this new executive action, saying it's bad for the country. Meanwhile, New York City continues expanding its arsenal of hotels, which are being converted into shelters, a policy which has reduced the supply of hotel rooms in the city by 20%. But although it looks like New York is digging in its heels for a long drawn-out ordeal, critics say the fact that we're welcoming asylum seekers at the same time there's a border crackdown is only going to encourage the people our government would want to deport to come here instead of going home, which critics say might make New York a destination not only for asylum seekers, economic migrants, but also for potential fugitives. So here we have buses, the cheapest way to travel the country from the southern border and come to a sanctuary city like New York, which is exactly what our elected officials here in the city and our elected officials at the federal level say they don't want to happen. But that's the opposite of what many people here in New York think. Right now, we've got protesters taking to the streets over this border ban, complaining that the new restrictions on immigration are bad for America, and they're not exactly being quiet about it.
Over 200 day laborers and low-wage workers, many of them migrants, danced and rallied in Manhattan's Herald Square Thursday around a giant shipping container they say is a symbol of the border wall.
The immigrant community is under attack by both parties.
Earlier Thursday,
as you can see, people here are not too happy about this, and they're going so far as to call it an attack on immigrants. And although the city's rapidly running out of resources to humanely care for the asylum seekers who are already here, the protesters insist that there should be more immigration to New York City, not less. But what many of the protesters protesters don't realize is that this new set of restrictions still allows for regular migration into the country, so much so that critics of the plan say it won't actually do anything. And the protesters may be forgetting that this is a federal policy. New York City's local policies have not changed. The right to shelter for anyone who wants it is still there and hasn't been diminished, which means the safety net critics say is responsible for this growing crisis here in New York is going to remain intact. But there's a problem with these federal restrictions that could cause the asylum crisis here in New York to drag out much longer than city officials are prepared for.
It comes after President Joe Biden's executive action this week significantly restricting asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, temporarily closing it if a daily average of 2,500 is met.
4 years ago, when he was running for president, he said he was going to support the immigrant community.
City, state, and federal.
So what you won't hear anywhere else is that the protesters, they've got a right to be upset about this once you look beneath the surface. Because although it may mean less immigrants end up coming to New York City overall, those who do make it are going to need to stay for much longer than those who've come in the past. And that's because of the hidden ramifications of this new policy. First of all, this new secure border plan allows asylum seekers to enter at approved points of entry as long as the 7-day average of crossings does not exceed 1,500 people. Now, protesters are upset about this new plan because prior to this action, 3,500 people a week were crossing on average. But the real problem is what's going to happen to the people who came all the way to the southern border and now can't come in this week. These are people who've traveled for months to get all the way to the point of entry at the border itself, and now they're being told you can't come in after they spent thousands of dollars and a lot of time to get there. What do you think they're going to do? Well, before we uncover whether or not this new policy is causing more harm than good, understand that critics of this policy are already saying it's going to put families and children at risk, and it's going to present a business opportunity to the worst elements of society, namely cartels and gangs, who can now manipulate people into believing they have safe passage options for them around the U.S.'s new border rules and Border Patrol itself. Critics say not only could this put the desperate and the vulnerable in an even worse position than they were already in, they say it's pretty much guaranteed to happen because right now New York is expanding its right to shelter options for people who might be on their way here while this crackdown is taking place. Critics have two major complaints with the new border plan. First, there are exceptions to the ban which critics find unacceptable, and second, New York City continues to expand its sanctuary apparatus, which they say acts as a magnet to attract the wrong kind of migration.
The new policy went into effect yesterday morning and is leading to some confusion, especially among migrants.
We don't 100% understand it. How could they possibly understand what's going on? They probably haven't even heard of it. It's not like there's radio or TV out.
So here's where those two issues end up working together. Right now, you've got thousands of people out in the desert who just found out about this, and they're being told, no, you can't come in, you have to wait. Yet everyone there still has it in their hearts to come to a city like New York where they can get a fresh start, which means it would be ridiculous to assume that these people are just going to turn around, pack their things, and spend money they don't have to get home. And the likely outcome of this policy is that people are just going to wait around until it's their turn to go through an approved point of entry. Or worse, they might not be able to wait that long. While these people are waiting, they'll likely be approached by gangs who want to get money from them in exchange for sneaking them into the country, creating another front in America's massive humanitarian border crisis. And the likelihood of this happening is so strong, mainstream sources are already blaring it.
The actual paths that people have available, which are very narrow to ask for asylum, it's very hard to compete with the misinformation that's out there from smugglers who have a very well-oiled business running.
Yeah, I bet, a profitable business, so you know.
So what they're saying here is that everybody who's now stuck at the border and can't move from their position while they wait indefinitely is now going to have to find a gang to sneak them into the country. And you know what that's going to look like? It's going to look like this 60 Minutes report from a few months ago where gang members helped people sneak in through a hole in the fence. And this is actually something critics on both sides of this agree on, that there now may be more unofficial entries than official entries. Because if you're out in the middle of the desert with no water and no supplies and a gang comes along and offers you a way in, critics say it's going to be hard for people in a situation like that to say no.
You hear stories of people in the most desperate condition. I talked to a group of men who had come from, and women, from the Dominican Republic. They were not the people who would be able to get asylum. They are what some call economic migrants, people who need to work, who are not getting work opportunities in their countries, who might have family members.
So while there's now speculation that this new policy may try and fuel unofficial crossings, there are provisions to try and eliminate that. First, if people try to cross the border on their way to a sanctuary city like New York and they don't do it officially, they could be banned from seeking asylum. And if that happens, your ability to get a work permit and start building your new life is in severe jeopardy. And that poses a real problem for New York, because if we're accepting people into our shelter system who can never end up getting a job because they didn't come into the country in an official manner, they might need to be in the shelters for a long time until that gets sorted out. A lot longer than the 30 days single adults have before the city kicks them out. Yet this news report also brings up the idea of economic migrants. People coming to the country not to seek asylum, but just to get a job and start working. Likely in jobs where they can do it off the books, like in construction or at a restaurant. Even though these jobs might be very unsafe, might not be legal, to many people they still represent a better opportunity than staying in their home country. Which is definitely an upsetting situation, but what critics are really upset about is that there are loopholes in this border ban that they say might make the whole crisis much worse and won't actually do anything to secure the border in the first place.
And while the president's new executive order can shut the border down, it does make some exceptions. For example, it does not apply to legal immigrants or to unaccompanied minors. And this is prompting criticism.
So what are these exceptions? Well, first, if you're already a citizen and you enter at a port of entry, of course they'll let you in. And this also applies to unaccompanied minors. We don't want children being denied entry at the border. That could be a very bad situation. But this is where critics say the new policy already starts to fall apart. What if somebody lies about their age, just so they can get on a bus and make their way to a sanctuary city like New York? Critics say this could be creating a situation where it's almost impossible to identify the people who are here, saying that there's someone who they might not be. Critics say this is creating a situation where you're going to have young men who are actually in their 20s claiming to be teenagers, who lost their parents and got separated from them just so that they can get help getting to a place like New York. But believe it or not, it's the other humanitarian exception to the border ban that has critics all riled up, because victims of extreme trafficking will also be able to get an exception. Now, of course, it would be the worst thing in the world to have people who are kidnapped remain at the border where they could be exploited continuously by gangs. But critics say folks will now be tempted to make up stories of kidnappings that never actually happened. Either way, the presence of gangs at the border means migration to New York City is not going to stop anytime soon.
It's not secure. They're coming. We still have our pursuits. The cartel has not shut its operation down, and they have no intent. They have the will to go ahead and exploit our border. If you look at where we've been for the last 3 years.
So the real reason this border closure is going to make things worse for a place like New York has to do with the fact that once people come here, they're going to have less options than they ever had before if they use a gang to do it. And unfortunately, coming to America's largest sanctuary city, but being barred from ever obtaining a legal job is a recipe for disaster. And it could end up trapping people permanently in the criminal underworld. And the biggest problem New York is having with its asylum crisis is that people in the shelters are finding it very tough to leave and get on their feet because the city itself is so expensive. And even though that's true, it's still better for many people to come here and try to find a job, even if it's not a job that you or I watching this might consider to be our best option in life, because it's so much better than the situation that they're in. Yet all this demand for access to New York City has turned the shelters here into revolving door operations, evicting folks who've been here for just 30 days so new folks can take their place and then be evicted to make room for the people who come after them. And this has brought up another issue for the local activists here to be upset about, because although 80% of New Yorkers say they support right to shelter, what they don't support is the fact that the people who are here can't start working immediately, even though that's how U.S. immigration law works. Which brings up a big question. Why is the U.S. so intent on allowing people to migrate here who are unable to help themselves once they arrive? So here we have a line of delivery bikes, and they are out in front of one of the city's shelters here in Midtown, the Row Hotel, which has 1,000 rooms. And the delivery bikes are here because they're part of an underground economy where identities are bought and rented out so that people can take delivery jobs without work permission. And the reason this is happening is because many of the folks that are in the shelters are being told they have to get jobs and move out and be self-sufficient, yet that's easier said than done when you can't exactly go apply for a job at Goldman Sachs. But why is it so hard for people to get jobs here legally if they've all been brought here with the intent to work?
This bill, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 that I'll sign in a few minutes, is the most comprehensive reform of our immigration laws since 1952.
They made it impossible to hire someone who was in the United States illegally or without employment authorization.
It traded amnesty.
1986. That was almost 40 years ago. And that means this entire time, New York City has had an asylum crisis that welcomes people here that have had to jump through pretty much every loophole they can find to get on their feet. It's not easy for them. And this is also the reason why so many people are finding it near impossible to get out of the shelters once they move in. And many people say this is part of the reason why we have a crisis here. It's illegal for folks to start working once they show up, and the only jobs they can get are jobs like this, riding a delivery bike, or working under the table at a restaurant, or in some sort of construction job. And since this has been the way immigration works in this country for a very long time, it seems kind of strange that people here are protesting those very same laws when the repercussions of those, people being stuck in a revolving door system that can't really help them, come to fruition. And honestly, you can't blame the asylum seekers. They're coming from parts of the world where there isn't enough food, and where economic opportunities of any kind are so hard to come by, it's worth risking everything to travel dangerously in many cases to a place like New York City. And what's fascinating about this is although New Yorkers say they support right to shelter, there are protests over the shelters all the time. And the protests come from pretty much every angle. If you put a shelter in a very nice neighborhood, the residents immediately come out and say, oh, this is inhumane, it's not the right place for them, you should move the shelter. And then if you put people in a hotel like this, people come out and say, oh, it's too expensive, you shouldn't do something like that. But wait, we already tried to save money, but we can't. That's why we have the hotels. And this is especially interesting to observe over at the city's 4,000 bed mega shelter in Brooklyn, which takes up an entire city block, where residents are complaining to the city about people's inability to work, as if this is something local officials can change when it is a federal policy. But there could be another reason why we aren't seeing a massive push for work authorization. And it's because some people say the people who've come here won't be able to get jobs and adequately mesh with our economy. Yet many of the people the city's now caring for moved into these shelters with the intention that they were going to get help getting a job. Yet 30 days after that happens, many people find out that things didn't work out the way they seem to have been promised. And obviously there are many reasons for this, most of which are beyond the city's control. First, English isn't everyone's first language, which automatically eliminates many employment opportunities. Second, the U.S. is an advanced service-based economy. We don't have the same types of manufacturing jobs that we used to. And a lot of today's employment opportunities require computer skills. And this exposes the real problem with this whole system. The people that are coming here need a lot longer than 30 days in a shelter in order to integrate with New York's economy. Yet New York appears dead set on inviting people here without the ability to provide for themselves or the ability to get it after they come here and get locked in to life in a country that doesn't have the tools to help them, and may have indicated at one point that it did. And even if you were to grant work authorization to every single person in every single shelter today, there wouldn't necessarily be employment opportunities for every single person tomorrow. Yes, we've got shortages of electricians, welders, truck drivers, you name it, but all of those jobs require sophisticated training. And this could be part of the reason why we aren't seeing a massive push at the federal level for mass work authorization, which is why critics say that the new border ban may solve some problems, yes, but it may also cause new problems nobody's prepared for, especially sanctuary cities like New York. Is that what's happening? Let me know what you think. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video.